Todd. Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to the large group. We hope your journal club discussions were fruitful and useful this morning. Based on some of the feedback that we got, we hope that this offered an opportunity to really use hubs and webs and start to work through them in groups. And you'll have that opportunity again in your IPG and again in your PIAT today. So we hope that you have that opportunity to sort of work through something that a couple of you were thinking about at the end of the day yesterday. To use Tom's framing from yesterday, in the next few minutes, we're just going to make some tacit knowledge more explicit in order to frame up yesterday and today within the context of course themes. Based on the chat during the B1 bomber case, you already can identify lots of systems themes. So now we're going to work our way up Bloom's taxonomy towards analysis and evaluation. So how is it going so far? How are we all doing? What stuck with you? Trying to check in on the group. So if anyone wants to raise a hand or share in the chat. Easiest question of the day, everybody. So nothing stuck with you? That makes me so sad.
Maybe everyone just needs another cup of coffee. I can start going door to door.
Oh, there's a comment in the chat. Hope we have a couple. Trying to deconstruct webs. The groups are going well. Okay, that's good. So we're starting to form a community, which is excellent because we consider you part of the family already. Validating to see how many people have similar questions and struggles. Absolutely. Drone delivered coffee would be helpful. I absolutely agree with you.
Lauren, this is Jane. I'll share. I'm really stressing out over the system sketch.
What's stressing you out, Jane?
I'm trying to not make it like a logic model because I've been struggling with it as far as trying to not have that kind of format, but really kind of show the complexity and what should be the focus. So actually, even from just the day's discussion, I'm already rethinking the actual course that I'm developing based on some of the conversations and the discussions that we've had already.
Well, thank you for sharing that. That's probably where a lot of people are and maybe aren't saying it. I know that when I took this course, I felt the same way. I kept changing my project every day. And the good news is that your IPG will be there to support that and to help you talk through it. So the system sketch that you built for today may be totally different tomorrow and totally different the next day. And it will evolve as the course evolves. And that's good. That means that you're really in a productive space. So I hope that's helpful and that your IPG will be exceptionally useful today as you talk it through. But nothing is static. Thanks, Jane. So I'm hearing a little bit of worry, rethinking the process. Rebecca's has already changed since yesterday. That's awesome.
Christina has her hand up.
Question by Christina.
Oh, Christina.
Yeah, hi, this is Krista. I was just going to build upon that, Jane, is I think it was really helpful when our IPG group facilitators indicated that your sketch is going to change throughout the week. So I'm here with an institutional group and we met last night and we're like, oh, our sketch, and we opted not to change it, not to stress out about it, just have the IPG group give us information and feedback, and it's going to evolve throughout the entire week, and to just be okay with that, because I think that feedback from my IPG group will be really helpful. I didn't want us to adjust it until we kind of got that feedback. So hopefully that helps not to stress or stress less about it.
Thank you so much for sharing. That's really helpful. A fun thing for those of you who are looking for a way to see your project evolve might be to use different colors of pens or fonts over the course of the week so that you can see where you started and how your project changed. We used to do this in the physical space with different colored markers each day, but that you can watch the evolution and it can be really interesting to see your thinking evolve. All right, well, thanks, everybody. So one note that we wanted to make, and this may be something that you've already noticed, but in the course, the term assessment is used as an umbrella under which program evaluation, learner assessment, and their intersections are situated. We know that learner assessment and program evaluation are different, but they're interconnected. Systems approaches often incorporate aspects of both. So at the end of this session, I'm going to post a link to an article by Josh Brown, who studies higher education, policy, and assessment. And the article is about 7 silos of accountability, which include assessment, educational evaluation, and educational measurement among them. And I found this piece to be really useful in my own organization, helping give us clarity, shared language, and definitions to work from. So I'll share that for the group. So today's theme is system architecture. I got some pictures of Boston architecture, since we can't all be physically together, but we all know where sort of Macy is located. These are from a travel blog. I did not take them myself. And architecture, and the way that we're using it for the course, includes what's fundamental to the system. So not necessarily everything about a system, but the essentials. It's the organization of the system, its components, their relationships, the environment, and the principles that govern its design and evolution. And so in yesterday's sessions and this morning's journal clubs, we looked at organographs, we looked at perspectives of stakeholders, the importance of determining boundaries, how things are interconnected, and how we communicate or how we don't communicate about them. These are all parts of your systems architecture, and that's sort of what you're working on with your systems sketch. The architecture includes the elements, the relationships, and the principles of design and evolution. The principles of design and evolution may even include things like state directives, national directives, what your accreditors are looking for, so things that might be considered specs. And this definition is adapted from the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers and the American National Standards Institute. So we learned this from the B-1 bomber and the Emily Wilson case, that there are other factors that can impact your system, and it's important to include them in your architecture, but to determine where the boundaries lie. We saw that in our journal club reading this morning. So what are the practical tips for your project and for the week? And this will sort of feed into how we can talk about our IPGs. To identify the purpose before you build, or to identify the purpose of something that's already been built and start rethinking it a little bit. So you will hear in your IPGs, and you would be encouraged to ask each other, what is the purpose of your project? How do you know that the project is necessary? We've talked about this already, but communication to ensure that stakeholders have an opportunity to vet decisions and trade-offs. So you'll see that a little bit in the journal club readings later this week. We'll talk about how you might engage stakeholders in having conversations about the trade-offs of decisions that you make, and having a system for that communication and those feedback loops. So that's another thing that you probably want to think about in the context of your project. And then evaluating the architecture through the development process. So anybody who works in UME in the US, the change in step 1 grading or other unforeseen changes that can influence the whole system. I think COVID pandemic also offers a really interesting lens on that. And to think ahead to construct your architecture so that you can figure out how it can be flexible and change and not get locked into things that may be potentially obsolete. So here are some prompts related to today's theme that you may want to ask each other in your IPG groups. Everyone will ask you to share your diagram or organograph, so please be ready for that. What's the goal of your project? What are the elements of your system and who are the stakeholders? So thinking broadly and narrowly about who the stakeholders are and how you hear from them. And how are the various elements of your project related to one another and other aspects of the system? Connie had that nice diagram with all the puzzle pieces. I think that's a good way to think about your project as you put it together. So the daily plan for today, we're already through journal clubs. We are in this session. We're at 3 minutes left. Then there's a case that will be with Tom in a virtual lectern where you'll be able to ask him questions. Then you'll go to your IPG, where each scholar will walk through their system sketch, talk about their program and their project's goals, and then have their first step back. After that, we'll have conceptual frameworks for assessing competence in the virtual lectern with Lou. And then you'll have your PIAT, which is putting it all together. And at the end of the day, there will be a series of faculty office hours that you can attend. You'll join the link and tell Todd who you want to talk to from that group. And the faculty will be ready with your to offer consultations when they can. So that was as quick as I could go. What questions and comments do you all have?
Tom, if you want to start your slide share while we're waiting for any questions.
Maxwell, yes, unless your IPG facilitators have told you otherwise, everyone should be presenting today at IPG. There are some facilitators who may have chosen a different approach, and that's okay too. So if you've heard different, I don't want to undermine their plan for you, but that's the expectation. Any other questions? Folks feeling okay? Now I can see how your faces are looking. Okay. Hearing no questions, I can turn it over to Tom. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Lauren. Thanks a lot. Well, good morning. And so what we're going to do this morning is discuss a case based on a new engineering college called the Olin College near Boston. So let me give you a little bit of an introduction, sort of orient you where you might find this college. So this is, you know, your usual Google map that we all got used to. So Olin College sits out here in Needham, Massachusetts, outside of Boston. I'm presently sitting somewhere around here. Typically you would be, if we are discussing this, somewhere in this area in Boston. So it is surrounded by other schools. There's Wellesley College in particular that they have access to. There's Babson College, which is right there where their campus actually is, there on the campus of Babson College. And there is a Brandeis also out here in the suburbs. This is a picture of Richard Miller, the first president whom you met in the case. So this is an aerial view of on the right of the completed college, and this is what is during the construction. And as you read in the case, the construction was delayed by a year. So they had to create some temporary buildings that actually initially housed some of those Olin partners, you know, where they did some of their work while they were finishing their constructions. And I'll be honest with you, in many of our projects that we've done, you know, construction has been delayed, and you know, people had to come up with flexible solutions. So this you know, since flexibility was something Lauren just mentioned, it's just what it is. You know, it's you have to be flexible sometimes. So that's a little bit of an introduction to Olin College. In terms of orienting this sort of along a model that we have used in the development of new schools, we will talk. There's first of all these sort of values and outcomes the planning that sort of gets into the mission and vision and strategy of the institution. And we will talk a little bit about the competencies and values. And then the academic planning happens, which should always happen in conjunction with resource planning, because if you can't do it, if you have limited resources, it just becomes an exercise in frustration. And then the academic planning looks at a bunch of things that we can look at today: the programs, how it's governed, you know, what's the student body looking like, and you know, what the faculty. We're going to talk about some of the faculty characteristics today, and we won't talk much about the infrastructure. But the piece we're going to really focus on, quite frankly, the piece that this course focus on, is to assure quality and outcomes. You know, how do we implement well? How do we operate well? And how particularly do we evaluate so that we are constantly improving? And you know, the sort of whole CQI kind of cycle. Okay, so that's just as a background in terms of what our discussion today will be on on the call on Olin. So I'll start the discussion, and I'm going to get out of presentation mode, and I'm going to hold on for a second. Let me get back into my. There we go. So I'm going to capture some of your ideas that we're discussing. Okay. So my first question to you is, what were the drivers for the creation of Olin? Why was Olin created?
I would say to meet the needs of engineers and engineers of the future. So engineering, the profession and the science, and federal needs, private needs.
Okay. All right. Okay. That's a pretty good goal, isn't it? I mean, that's a pretty good driver. Anything else? Any other reasons why it was created?
It was also supported by a charitable foundation that felt like this was the best method to kind of achieve their goals. So rather than working through already existent institutions to create a new one that could really be markedly innovative.
So they were looking for a new model. Okay. All right. Anything else that would drove this?
I would say to integrate engineering into additional fields that maybe it wasn't currently connected with. So how do you design a new program that opens doors for engineers in multiple different settings?
Okay.
I think another one is responding to the needs of the future employers.
Okay. Okay. That's can we subsume that under the first point? If that's okay with you, when I agree, the future, yes, including employers.
Yes.
And
okay.
To cultivate.
What was missing? I mean, what was missing there? Why are you bringing that up specifically?
The soft skills that they mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
That
It's
more.
It's Brian Geller. I just want to say that I don't know if you could subsume it into meeting the needs of the future, meeting the needs of future employers are necessarily the same.
Okay.
Societal needs and employers' needs might not be the same.
All right. Okay.
Lifelong learning.
Sorry about this. I'm screwing up here in my typing. Go ahead. Go ahead again.
Instill lifelong learning.
Okay.
To change the experience of engineering trainees from that of something that was loathsome to an enriching experience.
Yeah, because what did he say? I mean, most students, 50% of students dropped out because it was boring. It was badly taught. So the idea was making it actually fun, making engineering education fun. Okay, all right. So does anything of this resonate with you in terms of medicine or healthcare? Yeah, I hear some nodding. I see some nodding heads, etc. Yeah, so it's interesting, right? When we look at other professions, it sort of seems like that everybody's sort of struggling with similar things, right? We need soft skills. We need to integrate more with other fields. We are not meeting the expectations of our future employees, and we're not thinking, as Liz pointed out yesterday, necessarily about the future when we create a curriculum. Okay, all right. So let's go on in the case, and on page 4, there's a statement. There's a statement by Richard Miller, and I was wondering what your reactions were to that particular statement. Were any surprises?
This is Krista Tsela. It really resonated with me. I think innovation and then continuous quality improvement. I think that's certainly what I strive for in the work that I do. And there were a lot of statements in addition to that to kind of back that up about how to go about that.
Okay, Heather?
Yeah, I think that he's creating a learning organization, and to say we have to be first willing to look at ourselves is the way to set the tone and attract. We're headed next to who he wants to attract as administrators and faculty, and that's the right way to do it. To say, if you want to be part of this organization, we have to be willing to do that. And if that's not something you can do, then this will not be the right place for you.
Okay, all right. Catherine?
I think the 3 words that resonated to me the most were openness to change.
Okay.
Which is essential for all of the excellent earlier points.
Is that a typical attitude that you find in academia classically? Openness to change? And what is it?
That's a trick question.
Of the 52 institutions that I understand that are older than 500 years old, 50 are universities, and the other 2 are the Icelandic Parliament and the Catholic Church. So, academic institutions have a long life, but maybe it's interesting. Openness to change may not be necessarily their strong point. Okay, we've got a Bill.
Yeah, I was struck also by, yes, but what all my colleagues are saying in terms of the great attitudes herein, but also by when you hire a president of a new university that you're building, you might expect him to have the answers. And this is not a man who's representing himself as having any of the answers, but rather approaching the problem with curiosity, which is just not what you would get out of hiring a CEO in most professions. It's very, very novel that way.
Okay, so I don't have all the answers. We're going to solve this together. Okay, see it? Say it.
I like that statement about assessment is imposed externally without the buy-in from the community will not have a desired impact or results.
Okay, all right. So that's the other piece. I think he's talking about the fact that when assessment is imposed externally without the community commitment, usually that's not great. So you need stakeholder buy-in, right? The community has to really support it. Now, I'll tell you one word that struck me in this is humility. I mean that the word humility in this statement was something that really struck me, to be honest with you. And it's not necessarily the strength of some of the certainly elite academic institutions. Jane, you were going to say something.
Yes, and I'm sorry, I'm being distracted by my cat who's about to tear up my house.
That's okay. That's all right.
So humility was what struck me as well, is because when we think about us in academia, we're the experts and we're the ones telling people. So we're just, the flow of direction is one way, it's unidirectional. But what he's saying is that this, again, the egoless perspective and posture, and also be knowing that the information is going to be bidirectional. So that to me was kind of really stood out with that particular word.
Great. That's great. Okay, and one last one on this one, Krista?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to a comment in the chat. When you talk about openness to change, Brian made a comment about pointing out that it's easier to start kind of from scratch than to change an existing organization. And I think that's important to emphasize here.
Yeah, that's definitely. I mean, that's definitely true. I mean, it's so much. It's although I mean, obviously, starting from scratch has its own issues, and we can talk about that a little bit in a couple of minutes. But I agree. I mean, trying to, as somebody said, trying to change the not necessarily the direction of a tanker, but the direction of an iceberg is quite difficult. Okay, all right. So let's. Okay, so interesting choice for a president. Comes in with humility, thinks that we should learn from each other, and let's figure this out together. Okay, so there are 3 principles mentioned on the same page, on page 4 on the bottom. And I was just wondering, those are sort of the principles by which this college has to function. And I was wondering what your reactions were. And particularly, would you join them with those principles? I mean, when you look at it, right? So first of all, so what are they? the three principles.
So the principles I saw were there's no traditional tenure.
No
The school is
tenure.
not structured around traditional academic departments, physically or psychologically, and students all receive merit-based scholarships. And I think that those are three fantastic sort of tenets. I think the scholarships allow you to pick whatever students you think would be best for the program, regardless of financial ability to actually attend. So it gets rid of that barrier. The lack of tenure makes sort of, I think, people more equal on footing, both in the beginning and as careers progress, so that no one gets complacent. And the lack of sort of physical departments together keeps sort of ideas flowing rather than just stagnating within sort of a loop of self-thought.
What do you think might be some of the pushback against those things when you, particularly if you're, let's say, if you're hiring a faculty member or something? What might be some of the pushbacks that you might get?
I don't know if that was directed towards me, but if it was,
no, anybody.
okay.
I mean, what you can certainly answer if you want.
Okay. So certainly for the tenure, I could see there being pushback, especially if you are trying to hire someone who already has tenure elsewhere. So for like a brand new junior faculty, like it wouldn't matter because they're not going to get tenure initially. But if they're looking to get tenure 10 years down the road, then you might eliminate some people who don't want to take the risk of never being able to get tenure.
Okay. All right. Okay. Any other thoughts, Garth?
Yeah, I think the idea of no siloing at all, like no psychological siloing even, could be a little bit of a barrier for maybe younger faculty, I would think, who might need that sort of like that support to advance their career in their specific field. So if you're very comfortable in your field and you feel very comfortable interacting with other people and developing your career that way, that's great. But younger faculty may feel less comfortable with that kind of like less consolidated support.
Okay. All right. Rebecca, any thoughts? Any further thoughts?
Sort of extending that, I do think that's, the department and tenure and some of these traditional markers are markers of identity for faculty. So they really see their expertise reflected in some of these ways, and stripping those down is sort of forcing them to build back up a new framework of identity and expertise within the culture. And so they're really sort of forced to be more deliberate about how they carve themselves out and how they build themselves up and what kinds of things they do that get recognized when the traditional format isn't there.
Fair enough. Okay. Jim or James, how do you go? Sorry, you're still on mute.
Yeah, sorry, go by James. I think the last thing I just said, I think there's also an element of removing safety, which could be a bit of a challenge for some folks, because without a chair to kind of advocate for you for more resources or to protect you if the president turns against you, and without tenure to protect you if the institution's leadership changed all of a sudden, you're potentially a little bit more out in the wind, even though you are more free in some ways as well.
Okay. So with these two things, I mean, you're really looking for a different type of faculty, aren't you? So let's take a look at that. Can we take a look at the criteria for faculty, which is actually on page 5? Again, my question to you a little bit is, does anything here strike you as being unusual in terms of criteria for faculty? Things you may not have seen in your classic job description posted out there.
Well, I love that 5 of the 7 are focused on teaching, which we don't always see, particularly in R1 institutions.
Okay. All right. Anything else, Heather?
You got me. Thanks.
Oh, you got you. Sorry. My apologies. Catherine.
So I actually took a different approach. I didn't ask myself this question. My husband is a tenure track professor in geology and got this tenure track job 2 years ago. And I asked him, would he apply for this job? And he said, 100%, this is where I want to work. And the reason he said that is number 7, research risks. And to have that innovation and not have a clock of 5 to 6 years now because of COVID, 5 years to have X amount of publications. He feels very siloed because of those restrictions. So I think that to me was more informative than my own sort of medical MD focus. I wanted to share that with everyone.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks very much. Appreciate that. Holly?
I basically found just the word choices collectively interesting. I mean, words like creativity, passion, risks, integration, you will rarely find those in today's job descriptions for academic, health professions educators. And so I highlighted all of them because I thought that how interesting it was just to see a different perspective of a job description, and have passion as number 1 is really implying that you need people who want to be there.
Okay, great, thanks. Irene?
I think to just echo what everyone else was saying, my husband's an engineer and his school's actually pretty innovative. And then I was telling him this and I was showing him the list. He's like, I would have gone to this school in a heartbeat. Him, as sort of like the end user. And I think, a lot of us are really, framing this maybe in our context. At my institution, there's no tenure for people on the clinician educator track. But there's also potentially not a lot of risk taking either. And this idea of having education be just as important as research, being just as important as entrepreneurship, being just as like I think someone put in the chat, the 3-legged stool, right? That everyone's just bringing all the best of themselves for the common goal and this common mission to have a really great learning environment and educational experience. It's very energizing. Like I feel, there's so much energy and positive energy in these 7 criteria, as opposed to a lot of times what we see or potentially feel typically in academia.
Great. Mark and Keith and Kristen, now I'm going to stop this. Mark, go ahead.
Something I noticed was missing is grants or funding obtained by the applicant. Strikes as unusual.
So not a BYOM, bring your own money kind of application. Yeah, right. Okay. Right. Okay. Keith?
It was just what struck me is how you would go applying to come to this place. Traditional CV would definitely not nail these 7 points, and I think that that's in itself is going to attract a new type of teacher.
Yeah. Okay. So you're saying you might not find this in a traditional CV, typically what they're looking for here. Right. Okay. And then Kristen, sorry, I'm going to have to stop with Kristen. I'm going to move on to the next point.
So another point, and I think this has been in the chat as well, but the emphasis on being able to lead and to follow. Very, very rare that anyone gets ahead in academia if they're only following.
Fair enough. Okay. All right. So interesting choices for faculty. And I said earlier in my model, right? If you're trying to do a new academic program, you can't just only look at the content and the methods. You have to look at the ramifications to all other things. And that is your student selection, your students, and particularly your faculty development, and the kind of faculty that you want to attract. Otherwise, quite frankly, it probably will not work. Okay. So let's talk about the curriculum. In the curriculum, I just want to have a brief discussion about the curriculum for the next 3 or 4 minutes. Anything strike you about the curriculum? And I know there's large description of all of this, but is there anything again that you felt was unusual about the curriculum? Catherine. Irene?
I mean, number one, and this is my bias, I think we don't have enough humanities in the sciences. And the fact that they actually incorporated the humanities, I absolutely loved. I love the fact that it was like you see all of the traditional sort of engineering stuff here, you know, linear algebra, discrete math, etc. But the fact that it's seemingly very sort of integrated and layered in with a lot of like electives and the passion pursuits and those design projects that they're doing longitudinally and constantly getting sort of input like through these projects, it helps with like the team building and just sort of looking at things in lots of different ways, which I think echoes very much their values and their mission.
Great, thanks. Thanks very much. So say it again, Saya.
I like that very much. Number 6, to accommodate international and intercultural immersion experiences. I think this is rather unusual in most engineering curriculums.
Anything else? Bill again.
I agree that this is, very much in line with their mission of sort of equipping engineers with other softer skills. My big question reading this was, you're doing all of the same things your peer institutions are doing and layering on top of it some more formal training and creativity, as well as these longitudinal projects. Where is that time coming from, right? I just don't understand what they are giving up in order to add these admittedly very consistent with their mission elements.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. Quite frankly, we could talk about that probably for the next week in terms of, how do you create a different curriculum without just, quite frankly, layering yet another, layering yet something else on it, which basically means you have to totally restructure what you're doing, right? Priya, you had a hand up.
Yeah, I thought it's interesting that he included some instructional design actually in the goals where he talked about the capstone and the international immersion, because to me that contradicts the idea of creativity and innovation that he described earlier, and that you may want to allow people to think about how to reach the goal rather than giving them the process of how it happens. So that's just something that stood out to me.
So talk to me about that a little bit again, because there's the issue about creativity versus process, right? That's what you're getting at, Priya. Am I understanding you correctly?
Yeah, because he says in number 3 that he wants them to do a capstone project, and number 6 that he wants to have international immersion experiences. So that to me is a very specific way to reach a goal, which, I guess I was trying to see more was the bigger picture for him, and that maybe you don't want to be so specific. I mean, how did the capstone, maybe that's something that isn't the right approach, and there's other innovative ways to think about it.
Okay, I mean, we could talk about that, but it's okay. But I would argue with you that probably creativity probably does need a process, and that's so the question is whether they're trying to build this in. But again, anyway, I don't want to get sidelined, but it's an interesting question. It's a really interesting question. Lori.
Thought that the semester concluding project with the expo, the posters and presentations, was really interesting, that they invite external reviewers, and they not only provide feedback on the student performance, but also on the program as a whole. So I thought that was unique.
That's great. Okay, thank you. And then finally, before I move on, Francis.
I think what struck me, the first thing that came to my mind is, how are they going to measure these goals? The goals don't quite seem so smart. Okay, so looking at number 6, to accommodate immersion and experiences, for what reason? I just felt, I guess they have ways of measuring it, but that was my first impression.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the issue here is, we're still getting a broad outline, but you bring up exactly, it was germane to this particular course is, how would you measure the impact of this? How would you measure the outcomes? How do you make sure you're reaching your goals? Absolutely, we can think about that. And there's a ton of stuff in the appendices, that sort of gives you an idea of how they measure some of these things they're trying to accomplish. Okay, So I'm going to move on. So thank you very much. So an interesting school tries to do new things. Now the question is, you know, how do they, as you just mentioned, Francis, how do they actually have designed their metrics, their guideposts, know whether they are on the right track? So let me go back into presentation mode. So what I want you to do right now is I want you to go into, we're going to divide you into 10 groups, okay? And you see the assignment for the 10 groups, you know, so if you're in group 1 and 6, it's going to be student issues, 2 and 7 faculty, 3 and 4 courses, 4 and 9 curriculum, and 5 and 10 institution. So what I want you to do in the 10 groups is discuss the assessment and evaluation strategies that are outlined in the text and in the very detailed in the appendices, used by Olin for its various components, thinking about the following questions: what data are being collected and by whom? How are they utilized? And is there anything unusual or unique? And then please, in the end, have one member of the group briefly, I stress the word briefly, less than a minute, present your findings, okay? Sort of just very briefly. And what I want you to really look at is what is unusual and unique. That's really the number one question I'd like you to look at. Is there something that strikes you about the assessment or evaluation strategies for students or faculty or the courses or the curriculum or the institution that you find is interesting, is unusual, and also sort of aligns with what we've just been discussing, you know, trying to create this really new, innovative organization. Okay, so I'll give you until 15:15, okay, so till 15 minutes, in other words, to discuss this and in the groups, and then we'll present. Is the task clear? We're all good? Yeah. So, and the other thing that, Todd will briefly chime in right now because he'll post some Google Docs that you can use to collect your ideas, and one person can use that Google Doc if you want to quickly present. Okay, great. All right, thanks for doing this the last 15 minutes. So let's quickly go through this and gather some data after you've been, you know, brought back through the usual vortex here. So why don't we start with group 1? Why don't we just go through, you know, sort of one by one. Oh, you couldn't even jot our notes in Word. Okay, all right. Okay, so group 1, very quickly. What were some of your thoughts about the student assessment that you saw here?
Sure, I'm happy to share since I took notes. So we thought that some interest, they had some very classical elements, getting data from the students, their peers, faculty, external evaluators. We thought an interesting collection point was from the employers, from their internships, and they also conducted kind of midterm evaluations as well. They had some really unique domains of data, including teamwork, lifelong learning, entrepreneurship skills, and also the individual values for the college, which were distinct from their curriculum. And Audrey brought up kind of this beautiful idea of trying to get a sense of passion, this integration of both the head and heart. And they use them in very classic ways for thinking about their progress. But what was quite interesting is that we thought it was more of an EPA model of not thinking of them in terms of discrete years like freshman through senior, but really the longitudinal journey of development. And some other kind of unique components was that they used the feedback from the external evaluators. They had a competency framework for assessment, and they
tapped into multiple different types of frameworks to map to various competencies, which we thought was very unique for medical education. And we also thought that they used a mixed methods research design approach in which they triangulated both quantitative and qualitative research methods to get a more comprehensive picture of the students' progress. And oh,
go ahead.
no, and just to conclude, we thought that they used assessments for learning versus assessments as learning, kind of enhancing the CBME framework.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot. Group 2.
Yes, so we were looking at assessments of faculty. So you can see here some of the ways that they were collected. It looks like data are collected about faculty from students, faculty themselves, from peers, and from leadership. And part of the individual was a reflection that they have the organizational health survey, which isn't attributed to them overall, but is part of a tool that focuses on self-reflection of where they stand in different organizational values. These are all used. There is promotion. Faculty promotion is looked at, looks like on a 5-year cycle. And faculty development is also determined based on accumulation of some of these things. And the evaluation of faculty are connected to the courses. So the course reviews include evaluation of faculty teaching. It's not separated as a different thing. Things that we found some unique or interesting were that there are creative works that are a big part of the evaluation of vitality, intellectual vitality for faculty. So this otherwise looks like a typical dossier for faculty with teaching and scholarship, other scholarship and service, along with similarly, I guess in same size as others, looking at creative works that the faculty engage in. We're also interested at how aligned everything seemed to be, the data that were collected and how they wanted faculty to show up and to be involved. Those were the places where they evaluated faculty, how they showed up and how they were involved. And it also seemed like everyone, the stakeholders that came in contact with faculty had a say in that.
Great, thanks a lot. So we'll move on to group 3.
So for courses, they basically provide course evaluations both at the midterm point and at the end of the course. They also have what's called a What's Working Wednesdays, where faculty meet informally to discuss the progress of ongoing courses, and the results of the course evaluations are used for curricular improvement. One thing that we found sort of unique is that their midterm course assessments, they really take a subjective approach, and they really have the student reflect on their learning during the midpoint of the course, versus the end of course evaluation is sort of a little bit more typical of what we see at the end of a.
Okay, that's great, thanks. So group 4, the curriculum.
Hi, Sarah. And for curriculum, some of the data that's collected in there includes a lot of what's documented here in terms of the course evaluation. Parts of it that also is interesting is that outside reviews are included as part of the data that's collected, along with the student exit interviews and alumni survey. So I don't want to read the whole list.
Right.
How it's utilized in there really focuses a lot on the decisions that are going to be made. It's provided to the program groups, and the faculty and students and academics are able to review that for the annual curriculum retreat, and the data is used to make decisions on these curricular changes in the state of the curriculum report. Some of the parts that we thought were really interesting is the fact that the employer satisfaction is included in there as part of it. And that the student, another part that's really interesting is the student is really involved in the curriculum review as well. So those are just some of the key points.
Great, thanks. That's a nice distillation. Thank you. Next.
Okay, so for group 5, for the institution, there are kind of 3 main sources of data. They collected a national survey that is done across engineering schools that was referenced in the case as well. Then they had an internal organization health survey as well. And then there's sort of more ad hoc stuff, it sounded like, from the Board of Trustees and President's Council, where they would look for feedback on specific issues. So they're collecting data from across the institution. Some of it was being collected through a national survey that was a sort of external instrument, and then some was being collected via organizational survey that was an internal instrument. Utilization, so part of that was being used for regulatory requirements around accreditation. And then looking at the appendices, it looked as though some of the rest of it flowed into the state of the curriculum report and presumably fed from that kind of strategic space back into some of the curricular and other discussions. And in terms of unique or unusual things, we actually kind of just thought the whole process sounded a little bit unique. I think the notion of having a deep felt commitment to assessment, as the text stated, and one that really fed people to like looking at the organizational health and getting feedback from everybody about how the organization was doing, didn't seem like it was necessarily something we saw in our own institutions.
Great, thanks very much. So group 6, students, anything to add to what group 1 had to say?
And the only thing that we noted was while the data collected was very robust, it was sort of unclear how and when it was shared with the students. I suspect the policy was clear, but a couple of things were voluntary, like the meeting with the advisory dean. And so just making sure there was a regular sharing of information.
Okay, great, thanks a lot. Group 7, anything additional for the faculty?
Yeah, we were just mostly under the unique part about, just to reiterate about the intellectual health vitality. I mean, it really expects creativity and the fact that everybody's assessed, i.e. students, institution, courses and whatnot. We think that that was quite unique.
Great, thanks, Keith. Okay, next, group 8, in terms of courses, anything there more?
One thing I guess is the unique part, particularly we were talking about the midpoint evaluations and the fact that we're very formative in nature and very open-ended. So it did lead to a bit of a discussion there, but everything else we were similar with.
Yeah, it's actually something that's interesting, you know, because we did that actually for our course, you know, a while ago, and it's really interesting to have this formative feedback in the mid, sort of, you know, along the lines. It's sort of an interesting way, not making it too formal. Okay, group 9, anything to add to?
Sure. Basically, we wondered. They have a nice flow sheet for utilization, but we wondered what the CQI process was. We wondered, does it really work in reality? And are there a lot of meetings that don't accomplish things too? So otherwise.
I don't know. I don't know the insight into that. It would be interesting to get inside information from somebody. Okay. And then group 10. Anything additional for what group 5 said?
So for how it was collected, we had outcomes achieved, such as scholarships and graduate roles. To add to the how section, it was qual intensive and there was benchmarking used. And what we found was strange or unique was they would start from scratch if it was not working, and they were comparing themselves to liberal arts schools.
Yeah. Interesting that they would compare themselves as an engineering school to liberal arts schools, isn't it? You know, it's kind of an interesting thing. Okay, so thank you very much for doing this. What I really wanted to do is I sort of was, you know, with all due respect, forcing you to sort of dive into the details and sort of analyze, you know, some of the assessment strategies. And I hope the Google Doc will actually be useful sort of for the rest of the course, because I think there are lots of ideas here. That doesn't mean you have to all adopt them or adapt them, but there are lots of ideas here, I think, that I found at least somewhat unique about this school. And I want to thank, you know, I want to thank Connie, who wrote this case, for really diving into detail and sort of providing all these forms and the detailed sort of graphs. And so let me wrap up a little bit. So this is one of Connie's you know, ways of summarizing their assessment system. And I won't go into detail because it's in your appendix, you can go through it, but I think what's interesting are the 4 levels on the left that I think are sort of the classic questions we should ask ourselves as we evaluate or assess. Who receives the data? Who interprets the data? What are the decisions made based on the data or the evaluation, and who is empowered to act on the information? But because in many ways, what that does to me is it provides you with a systems-based basic blueprint for an assessment and evaluation. And that is, you know, the data that you need to generate in order to get decent metrics. Who there was identifying the recipients of the data, the people that monitor it, to make that sure that, you know, it's not garbage in, garbage out. the folks that interpret the data, that have access to it, and the decisions made on the data, the actions to be taken, because data without following actions are totally, utterly useless. They really are not. So the idea is, in an assessment plan, evaluation plan, in the systems space, we should understand that if X happens, if X is the case, why should happen? Somebody, and then the question obviously is identifying the parties that are responsible for these actions. And I would argue with you, the vast majority of assessment and sort of evaluation schema that I've seen don't meet all those points. And then you can obviously parse those as Olin did, you know, for the various elements, and you can add to these or parse them differently. But that's, to me, is sort of a general kind of overall blueprint that then can cascade down into more detailed, you know, kind of plans in terms of creating your assessment and evaluation system. So that's why I thought, and that's why we thought actually that this was a very interesting, you know, case to present and sort of dive into some of the details of how they've structured this, particularly coming out of an engineering school that really looked at being as, you know, using a CQI cycle. So that's really the end of my remarks here and the end of the case, and I'm open for questions and comments, I believe, for the next 15 minutes. Is that right, Tom?
That is correct.
Any questions or comments?
I guess one thought, like just kind of building off a little bit of Liz's article about medical education as a process management, you know, the challenge, it seems like, I think people in the chat were agreeing this is a beautiful model. And I think the challenge is just how do we take our present institutions and kind of shift them over to that, given the resources we have at hand.
Yeah, it's. I mean, you know, one of the, as you know, there's an old formula about the utility of assessments, right? Which has a bunch of stuff in the denominator, and then it has one thing pretty much in the denominator or something, or, you know, but practicality is one of those things, right? And resources is another one, because it's, you know, it's got to be practical. Somebody has to be able to do it, and you have to have the folks to do it. But on the other hand, you don't also don't want to be in that old sort of joke about the, you know, the drunk that lost his keys and is looking under the street light because it's the only place he can see, right? You really want to make sure that you get the data that are necessary in order for you to fulfill your goals. And I think very often that's where I see the disconnect in some institutions. What is your overall goal, and are you collecting the data that actually inform whether you're getting to your goals? Because I think very often we just sort of, you know, get siloed in sort of, you know, little areas. Okay, we got to now evaluate this person for this particular reason, but how does it link to the mission and the goals? And that was one of the reasons for sort of, you know, looking at this case in detail. By the way, Todd will post an epilogue, which is something in 2016. We did a follow-up on Olin College. And Olin College right now has 330 students, almost half of which are women, 48% of which are women. And they still have those three major programs that were outlined. And they've been quite successful. They are now, I think, ranked #3 in the engineering schools. So it's been quite a successful enterprise, and they've done quite well. But there are things that have happened, and I'll be very open with you. The faculty revolted because, interestingly enough, their evaluation system, their sort of promotion criteria, went back to the three-legged academic stool with a lot of sort of emphasis on research. You know, and they said, wait a minute, that's not what you hired us. So they had to change accordingly. And Connie can give you some greater detail if you want. But you know, I don't want to paint this as a rosy picture of everything was perfect. none of these things are perfect from day one, and there's a lot of going back. This is a spiral process that very often actually is a reverse spiral, where you have to sort of take 2 steps back and then hopefully 3 steps forward to get something accomplished. But overall, they've been quite successful, and students still get, as far as I know, half of their tuition paid through scholarship. Maybe not totally, but at least half of their tuition gets paid for scholarship. Any other questions or comments? Yeah.
I could just add a comment to that. The reason they had to go to half tuition is that the financial crisis of 2008 caused for them a huge dip in the endowment that they had. And so they reluctantly went to that, really reluctantly. I was actually on the board at that time. The other thing I would add on, since resources keep being brought up and how are we going to do this in our institutions, the reason this school was set up is that the foundation that started it had been for 20, 30, 40 years distributing hundreds of millions of dollars to colleges all across America. And that's why many of you, if you went to an American college, you might have had an Olin library or an Olin engineering school. I know I did. I had both at my campus. And what they discovered was that nothing changed. Huge buckets of money were given to these institutions, but none of them changed their processes. They kept teaching the way they always taught. They kept producing engineers the way they always did. And so the foundation actually said, the only way we're going to create the kinds of engineers that we want, who are going to be innovators and entrepreneurs and great communicators and team players, we ought to build our own college. And they really lived with that mission and still do to this day. So it's an interesting, comment on what happens when some of us in the very traditional schools get boatloads of money. Does anything really change?
So with that, we're past time. So we will move into the virtual lectern time now. So if anyone wanted to start their break now, feel more than welcome to. But if anyone still has lingering questions, we have Tom and we have Connie here until 11:45. Thank you very much, Tom.
Thanks for your participation. It was a great discussion. Thank you.
I think Bill has his hand up.
Thank
Bill,
you.
go
Yeah. I'm stuck staring at this sort of schematic Connie put together about who gets the data, who interprets the data, et cetera. And this thing I'm stuck on is the decision to be made, right? Because there's multiple stakeholders on that little box. And the obvious analogy is when you are in a department of medicine, simultaneously the chair of that department has an obligation to have a medicine clerkship that does these things, right? Advancement, progress on the curve, and decisions about entrustment. But simultaneously, that person is making employment decisions further down the line, or indirectly through the program directors making employment decisions. And so it's kind of this paradox of evaluation needing to do 2 separate but not always related tasks. Has anyone had experience in sort of reconciling those? Because I think a lot of the pressure as some of us attempt to move away from tiered grading comes from residencies who are given the impossible task of selecting from several thousand applicants their class. Any ways that have been helpful in talking to residency leadership about this issue?
I'm trying to, so if I've understood you correctly, the first question was about this sort of the fact that the chair of a department really has multiple things they have to do. They have to run a clinical enterprise at the same time. They have to teach. Was what
I can simplify a little bit. I can simplify a little bit and say that different stakeholders want the evaluation to do different things. The medical school leadership may want to make these decisions. Is this person advancing appropriately? Do they need remediation or coaching? Are they ready for independent practice? Whereas the residency side, who is an employer, may feel strongly, especially because most institutions have in-house pipelines for house staff. They may feel strongly that this evaluation needs to tell them who is a standout, who is going to be a great employee. And is there a way, and then they usually have control of some degree of what the evaluation actually does, right? The med school does not exist in a vacuum from the departmental leadership. Is there a way to square that circle other than getting everyone in a room and having them fight it out? Is there something that can be helpful in terms of navigating that?
I mean, I'll take a stab at it and I'll ask others to chime in. I mean, the way I look at this is these are not mutually exclusive kind of tasks. You know, on the one hand, there's this thing that we have to do as institutions to make sure that whomever we produce, as I said on the first day, is competent and can be released into the world, right? I mean, that's one thing that we have to do. And then the other thing is obviously that, you know, any kind of clerkship, any kind of or even residency later on is an extended job interview, right? At the same time, I mean, because you're looking at your pipeline, you're looking at whom do you want to attract. So I don't see those two things as being necessarily separate, but but there is this neutral obligation to assure that whomever goes through your training program is competent, I know, to move on. And I think, and if they're excellent and there's something you want to attract, to me, that's an extra bonus, but it's obviously something a chair would be interested in. So I see this as two books. There's one book that the medical school and the student needs for general purposes, and there's the other book that you say, okay, here is my pipeline. Here are the folks I would like to attract.
I might add something too. It was interesting in the beginning, it was high risk takers, students that applied, and it was high risk faculty that were from some very prestigious engineering programs that didn't like the way engineering was being taught that came. And the students self-selected. They had these practicums where they went out and worked in businesses and got very excited. And a lot of the people supporting the program and the oversight committee from industry, kind of the blue ribbon companies, were so impressed with the curriculum. They wanted to recruit these systems or students at graduation, and they preferred to go to some of the more innovative companies that were startups. And actually some of them started their own startup companies while they were in Olin. So I think they appreciated the exciting things that happened in their program, and that was a big disappointment of some of the companies. The second thing was the faculty who threw their heart and soul into the development of the curriculum and teaching. When it came time for their contracts to be renewed, since they didn't have tenure, were held to these, as Tom mentioned, the criteria that were kind of traditional for academics. And they up and rebelled. And they went through, I think it was a 1.5, 2-year process where they designed their own contract renewal criteria, which everybody ended up being much more happy with. And it acknowledged their contributions along those same early criteria that the school had designed for students and everybody working in the community. So it was an evolution. And I think it still remains a very, very successful one, but took a lot of time.
Yeah, so Bill, I mean, one of the things that, I often, that people have but struggle with is, and I've talked to folks, colleagues of mine, friends of mine who work in other industries, is how do you make sure that you can evaluate somebody based on their teamwork, but at the same time give them an individual evaluation? That's sort of similar. Again, that's, on the one hand, you need to make sure your organization, is functioning, they actually are learning how to do teamwork. On the other hand, you want to reward individuals that are excellent, that are trying to move up. And it's kind of interesting because, I had a lot of pushback from students, for instance, when we were trying to evaluate teams based on their work, right? They said, how am I going to get my
Am I liable for my teammates' performance?
Yeah. So it's kind of, and I think we're struggling with that. Whereas in other industries, I think it's pretty, it's something, particularly in the Army, quite frankly. I mean, Luke can if he wants to, but I've some of the armor literature I've read, I mean, there's still, you understand that if you don't do teamwork, you might be dead, which is an interesting interesting incentive.
Strong incentive, certainly.
But at the same time, you want to be advanced. Not everybody can be a four-star general. So it's an interesting conundrum. I think we have two books all the time, and both are necessary in order to make things work.
I appreciate the perspective. Thank you.
All right, it's lunchtime, isn't it? At least on the East Coast. Maybe breakfast or dinner for somebody else, or midnight snack. I don't know where you are. So if there are no further questions, I want to thank you again for your participation. I hope you have a great rest of the week. And as I said, I'm traveling as of tomorrow night. So hopefully, and I would actually like some feedback actually on the video as well that I prepared, for the introduction. So, I'd be very happy to get some feedback on that, and obviously feedback on the usual on the sessions as well, which comes automatically, sort of. But I would be really interested to hear, whether the video was useful or not, and what I can improve, and what was not useful at all. Okay, so thank you very much, and good luck to everybody, and stay healthy.
Wonderful. Thanks, Tom. Safe travels.
You. Yeah, safe travels, Tom. Thank you for both of your sessions and the video.
Okay.
All right, everyone.